A little beggar girl found a millionaire's wallet. In gratitude, the millionaire offered a reward, and what the girl asked for in return made the millionaire break down in tears. The Grand Oak Grill restaurant stood out on the bustling Reformer Street in the heart of California. Its century-old stained glass windows reflected the golden light of the evening, while impeccably dressed waiters circulated among tables decorated with fresh flower arrangements and silver cutlery. At the most secluded table in the establishment, Sterling Calloway held his coffee cup with trembling hands, trying to maintain his composure before the three businessmen who could save his businesses from imminent bankruptcy. His Italian suit couldn't disguise the weight of worries he carried on his shoulders, and the deep dark circles betrayed sleepless nights. As he listened to the potential investor's proposal, he nervously scribbled numbers and contacts on a piece of paper, which he soon put away in his leather wallet. Outside the restaurant, leaning against a pole, little Opal Monroe watched the movement of customers with attentive and hungry eyes. Her unkempt black hair framed a thin but delicate-featured face that carried a maturity incompatible with her 12 years. Dressed in simple and tattered clothes, she alternated her gaze between the people leaving the restaurant and the darkening sky, knowing she needed to go home before nightfall. Her grandfather was ill, urgently needing the medicines she couldn't afford. "Just a few more minutes," she murmured to herself. "Maybe someone will leave some scraps I can take home." At Sterling's table, the tension increased by the minute. The businessmen were ready to make an offer that could save his companies from bankruptcy, but the terms seemed increasingly unfavorable. With nervous fingers, he took the wallet out of his pocket, checking the numbers and essential contacts jotted down once more, which could offer better alternatives. His mind was divided between the urgent need for capital and the fear of losing control of everything he had built. "Gentlemen, I appreciate the offer," he began, putting the wallet back into his jacket pocket, "but I need a few days to analyze the terms with my lawyers." Meanwhile, Opal felt her stomach growling with hunger. She thought of her grandfather, whom she had left at home with only a piece of stale bread to eat. Mr. Monroe was her only family, and seeing him wasting away day by day for lack of medicine broke her heart. Her small calloused hands gripped the hem of her worn blouse, while her eyes filled with tears. "Grandpa, forgive me for not being able to help more," she whispered, swallowing the sob that threatened to escape. Sterling rose from the table, politely bidding farewell to the businessman. His body was tense and his mind swarmed with worries. The papers in his wallet contained crucial information, contacts of other investors who could offer less harmful deals. He adjusted his jacket and walked towards the exit, mentally calculating how much time he would have, until his creditors started pressuring him again. "I need to find a solution before it's too late," he thought, passing through the door the waiter held open. The cold evening wind made Opal shrink even further against the pole. Her tired eyes followed the movement of the last customers leaving the restaurant when something caught her attention. A dark object fell from the pocket of a man in a suit who had just stepped out. It was a leather wallet that silently slid onto the middle of the sidewalk. "Sir," she tried to shout, but her voice came out too weak to be heard. Sterling walked briskly, completely distracted by his problems. He didn't notice when his wallet slipped out of the poorly closed jacket pocket, falling soundlessly onto the sidewalk. His thoughts were focused on the next steps he would need to take to save his businesses. "Maybe if I can renegotiate with the bank first," he muttered to himself as he waited for his driver at the corner. Without a second thought, Opal left her observation post. Her bare feet moved quickly across the sidewalk towards the fallen wallet. As she picked it up, she felt the soft leather between her fingers and saw the photo of the man in the suit on the ID peeking out. Her heart raced as she looked in the direction he had gone. "I need to return it," she decided, clutching the wallet to her chest. "It's the right thing to do." At the corner, Sterling finally spotted his driver approaching. He was about to get into the car when his fingers touched the empty jacket pocket. A chill ran down his spine as he realized his wallet was gone. All the important contacts, the crucial notes for his negotiation, were inside. "My God, I can't lose those numbers," he muttered in panic, turning to retrace his steps. A gruff, deep voice cut through the air like a razor. "Stop, thief!" The girl stole the man's wallet. It was a shopkeeper sweeping the sidewalk in front of his store, accusingly pointing at Opal. The startled girl clutched the wallet tighter and began to run towards Sterling, who was now watching her from across the street. "No, I just want to return it," she cried in despair, but her words were swallowed by the noise of cars and the chorus of accusations that began to rise. The shopkeeper's shout echoed down the street as Opal clutched the wallet to her chest, her heart pounding so hard it seemed to want to escape. People around her began to look in her direction, some already pointing accusing fingers. The girl tried to explain, but her thin voice could barely be heard amidst the confusion that was forming. Her eyes stung with tears of fear and frustration as she watched more people joining the shouts of accusation. "Please listen to me. I just want to return it to its owner," she pleaded, her voice trembling with every word. The merchant, a corpulent man with a stained apron, continued his ruthless accusation, gesticulating frantically with the broom he held. Other shopkeepers began to emerge from their establishments, drawn by the commotion. Opal felt the weight of all those judging stares, recalling her grandfather's words about how people often judge the poor without knowing their true intentions. "They'll always think the worst of us, my little one," echoed her grandfather's voice in her mind, as she struggled against the urge to simply drop the wallet and run away. Across the street, Sterling watched the scene with a mixture of concern and confusion. His driver had already parked the car, and he tried to understand what was happening. The wallet in the little beggar girl's hands did seem to be his, but there was something in the girl's desperate expression that prevented him from joining the accusations. "Wait here," he ordered the driver. "I need to understand what's going on." Something isn't right about this story. The crowd began to close in around Opal, with increasingly hostile voices demanding she return what she had stolen. Her bare feet scratched the asphalt as she took hesitant steps backwards, seeking an escape route. Fear now completely dominated her thoughts, mingling with guilt for not having simply ignored the fallen wallet. "Grandpa always says doing the right thing is most important. But what if no one believes you?" she thought, feeling tears stream down her dirty cheeks. Her group of teenagers exiting a clothing store began shouting even louder, encouraging others to grab the little rat. "She's a little thief." Panic gripped Opal when she saw some men moving towards her with threatening expressions. Her legs trembled, but the survival instinct spoke louder. "Don't touch me, I didn't steal anything," she screamed with all the strength she could muster, her voice finally rising above the tumult. Sterling tried to cross the street, but the heavy late-afternoon traffic prevented him. He watched helplessly as the situation rapidly deteriorated. He could see the terror in the girl's eyes, and something in his heart told him he was witnessing a terrible injustice. "Stop it! Leave the girl alone!" he tried to shout, but his voice was lost in the chaos that had settled in. The merchant, now even more exalted, began to advance towards Opal with the raised broom. "You're not going to run off with that wallet, you little thief!" he roared, encouraging others to help surround the girl. Opal felt her world spinning, the accusing voices mingling in her head like a nightmare she couldn't wake up from. "Why won't anyone listen to me?" she sobbed, feeling increasingly cornered. A lady passing by with shopping bags joined the chorus of accusations. "These street kids are all the same. They only know how to steal and do wrong to decent people." Her words were like stabs in Opal's heart, as she saw her efforts to do the right thing turn into her worst nightmare. "That's not true!" she screamed between sobs. "My grandfather taught me to be honest." The situation had turned into a veritable street trial, with more and more people joining the accusations. Opal looked desperately in all directions, feeling suffocated by the circle of people closing in around her. It was then that she spotted a small gap between two parked cars. It was her only chance to escape that enraged mob. With her heart pounding, she made the decision that would change her life forever. "I'm sorry, Grandpa," she whispered, before gathering all her courage to attempt a desperate escape. A few meters away, Sterling finally managed to find an opportunity to cross the street. He was now running towards the commotion, shouting for everyone to stop, trying to explain that this was a misunderstanding. But his words arrived too late. Opal, in her desperation to escape the hostile crowd, had already launched herself between the cars towards the busy avenue. "My God, no!" Sterling shouted, seeing the inevitable about to happen. Time seemed to freeze as Opal ran between the parked cars. Her bare feet barely touched the asphalt as she moved towards the other side of the avenue. The noise of the crowd now sounded distant, muffled by the sound of her own heart pounding in her ears. The wallet still clutched tightly against her chest was her only proof of innocence. But at that moment, it seemed more a curse than a good deed. Between tears and sobs, her thoughts turned to her sick grandfather waiting at home. "Forgive me, Grandpa. I just wanted to do the right thing," she whispered to herself as she ran. Sterling watched the scene in slow motion, his body paralyzed by the terror of what was about to happen. He saw the traffic light turning green, heard the roar of engines coming back to life, and realized that the girl, in her desperation, had not noticed the danger. His legs began to move before his brain even processed the action. "Stop! For God's sake, stop!" His scream cut through the afternoon air, but it was too late. The sound of screeching brakes echoed along the avenue. The impact was violent and silent at the same time. Opal's small body was thrown several meters ahead, the wallet still firmly held in her hands. The driver of the car, a middle-aged man, emerged from the vehicle in despair, his hands trembling as he tried to dial the emergency numbers. The same crowd that seconds before had pursued her now watched in shock, many covering their mouths with their hands, others turning away to avoid seeing. "Someone call an ambulance!" Scattered voices shouted in the crowd as remorse began to weigh on everyone. Sterling finally reached Opal's fallen body, kneeling beside her without caring about his expensive suit getting dirty on the asphalt. His eyes filled with tears as he saw the girl's battered face, but he noticed she was still breathing. Carefully, he tried to keep her awake, speaking softly. "Stay with me, little one. You're going to be okay, I promise." "You didn't do anything wrong," he whispered. His voice choked with emotion as he saw her fingers still clinging to his wallet. The shopkeeper who had started the whole commotion was now pale, his broom forgotten on the floor as he watched the consequences of his hasty accusations. Remorse was visible on his face as he approached Sterling, trying to offer help. "I didn't know. I thought." But his words died before they were complete, choked by the weight of guilt. Sterling simply ignored him, all his attention focused on the injured girl. Sirens began to sound in the distance, quickly approaching. Opal, semi-conscious, muttered disconnected words about her grandfather and medicines. Her eyes opened and closed with difficulty as she tried to focus on Sterling's face. With a tremendous effort, she extended the hand holding the wallet in his direction. "I just wanted to return." Her words came out in a faint voice before her eyes closed again. The ambulance arrived with its red lights cutting through the California dusk. The paramedics worked swiftly and efficiently, assessing Opal's injuries while preparing the stretcher. Sterling watched their every move, his heart gripped by guilt and worry. "Will she survive?" he asked anxiously to the nearest paramedic, who only responded with a professional nod as he continued his work. When they began lifting Opal to place her on the stretcher, Sterling noticed that her small fingers still refused to let go of the wallet. The paramedic tried gently to remove the object, but the girl, even unconscious, held it with surprising strength. "Leave it with her," Sterling intervened, his voice choked. "That wallet now means much more than any value it has inside." The crowd parted in silence as the paramedics took Opal to the ambulance. The sun was already setting on the horizon, painting the sky red as if nature itself reflected the drama of the moment. Sterling, without a second thought, informed that he would accompany the girl to the hospital. As he entered the ambulance, his eyes fixed on the wallet still gripped in Opal's hands. "How many times do we misjudge people?" he thought, feeling the weight of that truth in his heart, and how much it can cost. The ambulance doors closed with a dull thud, and the sirens sounded again, now carrying not only an injured girl, but also a painful lesson about prejudice and hasty judgments. The crowd began to disperse slowly, each person carrying with them the weight of what they had witnessed. The shopkeeper, still standing in the same place, watched the ambulance driving away and muttered a silent prayer. "May God protect that girl, and forgive us for our cruel judgment." A few minutes later, near where the accident occurred, the San Angel Hospital stood out in the Mexican night as a monument to modernity, its white walls and illuminated windows contrasting with the dark sky. In the luxurious emergency room reception, Sterling Calloway paced back and forth, his suit still stained with asphalt, his hands trembling every time he looked at the wallet he had finally managed to make Opal release. Doctors and nurses rushed past, some casting curious glances at the visibly distraught businessman. "Please give me some news," he repeatedly murmured, his gaze fixed on the doors leading to the surgical center. The hours dragged like an eternity, as the doctors worked to stabilize Opal. Sterling had insisted that she receive the best possible treatment, no matter the cost. His hands kept touching the wallet, now no longer for the important documents it contained, but for the symbolism that object had acquired. With every minute that passed, the weight of guilt seemed to increase on his shoulders. How could we misjudge an innocent child so badly? He thought, feeling tears in his eyes. The activity in the hospital continued unabated, even during the early morning hours. Nurses changed shifts, carrying medical records and pushing empty stretchers through the silent hallways. Sterling had refused all suggestions to go home and rest. Sitting in a leather armchair in the waiting area, he opened the wallet again, observing the papers with the important contacts that had worried him so much hours before. How insignificant this seems now, he whispered, putting the papers away again. A middle-aged doctor with a serious expression and an impeccable lab coat finally approached Sterling. Her words were precise and professional, but carried a tone of genuine concern. Opal had suffered some bruises and a mild concussion, but she was stable. Sterling listened to every word intently, his heart gripped with each detail about the girl's condition. "Will she be okay, doctor?" he asked with a choked voice, fearing the answer. The first rays of sunlight began to enter through the hospital windows when they allowed Sterling to visit Opal in her room. The businessman felt his legs weaken as he saw the small figure covered in machines and tubes. His steps were hesitant as he approached the bed, observing the injured face of the girl who, even unconscious, still maintained a serene expression. "How can someone so small have such strength?" he murmured, carefully taking one of her hands in his. The heart monitor maintained its steady rhythm, filling the silence of the room with its regular beeps. Sterling had requested a private room, ensuring that Opal would receive all the necessary attention. As he watched the girl's battered face, he began to speak softly, as if she could hear him. "You tried to do the right thing, little one. Now it's my turn to do the same for you." The movement of the hospital increased as the morning progressed. Doctors made their rounds, checking vital signs and adjusting medications. A nurse entered to change the saline drip, gently commenting on how rare it was to see someone so concerned for a stranger. Sterling merely nodded, his eyes never leaving Opal's face. "She's not a stranger," he finally replied. "She's my guardian angel." The tests continued to show the severity of the situation. In addition to external injuries, there was concern about possible internal injuries. Sterling listened to each medical explanation with renewed attention, making mental notes of everything that would need to be done. With each new diagnosis, his determination to help increased. "No matter the cost, no matter the time, she will get the best possible treatment," he stated to the medical team. After almost 12 hours of waiting, the first signs of consciousness began to appear. Small finger movements, a change in breathing rhythm. Sterling, who had not left the room even to eat, leaned eagerly over the bed. Opal's eyelids fluttered lightly, struggling to open. "I'm here, little one. You're safe now," he whispered, gently holding her hand. Opal's eyes finally opened, disoriented and scared. Her first impulse was to try to move, but the pain made her groan softly. Sterling quickly pressed the button calling the nurse while trying to calm the girl. "Don't try to move, you're in the hospital. Everything will be okay," he spoke softly, seeing the initial panic give way to a look of recognition. The nurse arrived quickly, checking vital signs and administering pain medication. Opal remained silent, her eyes now fixed on Sterling, as if trying to understand why he was there. When she finally managed to speak, her voice was just a hoarse whisper. "The wallet. I didn't steal. I swear." Sterling felt his heart break upon hearing those words. Even after everything she had been through, her first concern was to prove her innocence. Taking the wallet out of his pocket, he showed it to Opal with a gentle smile. "I know, little one. You tried to do the right thing. You are very brave and honest," he said, seeing tears form in the girl's eyes. The doctor returned to perform more exams, taking advantage of Opal being conscious. Meanwhile, Sterling finally had time to examine the contents of his wallet more closely. Among the papers with important contacts, he found something he had not noticed before, a small crumpled pharmacy receipt, fallen from Opal's pocket during the accident. Upon reading the name of the medication and the price, everything began to make sense. "So that was it. You were trying to raise money for medicine," he muttered to himself, feeling a new wave of emotion. The results of the new tests were promising, showing no permanent damage. Sterling listened to the medical report with growing relief, but his mind was already working on another plan. Watching Opal fall asleep again, now more peaceful under the effect of the painkillers, he made a decision that would change both of their lives forever. "Doctor," he called out to the physician who was leaving, "I need to know what is required for me to become responsible for this girl during her recovery." The afternoon sun was already setting when Opal woke up again, finding Sterling still by her side, now with some documents in his hands. Their eyes met, and she tried a small smile, still confused by the whole situation. Sterling leaned in, affectionately adjusting the blanket over her shoulders. "Rest, little one. From now on I will take care of you and your grandfather. You are no longer alone," he promised, seeing her eyes fill with tears of gratitude and hope. The hospital room gradually gained golden tones with the light of dawn when Opal began to wake up again. Her eyes blinked several times, trying to adjust to the brightness, while her mind struggled to organize the confusing events of the night before. Her aching body protested with each small movement, and the machines around her emitted sounds that frightened her. She saw Sterling dozing in the armchair beside the bed and tried to move, grimacing in pain. The sudden movement awoke the businessman, who immediately leaned towards her. "Easy, little one. You need to stay still so you don't worsen your injuries." Tears began to stream down Opal's face as memories of the accident came back in flashes. The wallet, the shouts of the crowd, the fear, the approaching headlights. Her fingers gripped the white hospital sheet as sobs shook her injured body. Sterling gently held her hand, trying to calm her. Between sobs, she managed to mumble, "My grandpa, see, he's alone. Needs his medicine. Must be worried." Sterling called the nurse when he noticed Opal's agitation increasing her pain levels. While the nurse adjusted the medication, he tried to calm the girl, promising they would find her grandfather. The nurse finished administering the medication and checked her vital signs before leaving. "Mr. Calloway," she said softly, "she needs to stay calm. Stress can worsen her condition." The following minutes were tense, with Opal fighting against the effect of the sedatives, determined to explain where her grandfather lived. Her words came out broken by sobs and groans of pain. Sterling took a notepad and pen, ready to write down every detail. "Please, I need to know where he is." "I'll send someone to check on him right now," he promised, seeing the despair in the girl's eyes. With a weak and trembling voice, Opal began to describe the way to her home, a small dwelling in the back of an alley in the poorest neighborhood of the city. Each word seemed to cost her an immense effort, but she continued, driven by concern for her grandfather. Sterling meticulously noted everything, his heart aching as he heard the precarious conditions in which they lived. "There's a blue door. Peeling. He can't walk properly. Needs his medicine." As soon as he got the full address, Sterling made several calls. First to his trusted driver, sending him immediately to the indicated location. Then to his personal team, organizing all the necessary support. Opal watched his every move with anxious eyes, struggling to stay awake. "Please," she whispered, "say he's going to be okay." Time seemed to drag as they waited for news. Sterling alternated between making calls and comforting Opal, who remained agitated despite the medication. A nurse came in to change the serum and check the bandages, taking the opportunity to try to distract the girl. "You're very lucky to have someone caring so much about you," she gently commented, but Opal only responded with more tears. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, Sterling's phone rang. It was his driver, confirming that he had found Mr. Monroe in a debilitated but alive state. The relief on Opal's face upon hearing the news was visible, though there was still concern in her eyes. "Is he very sick?" she asked anxiously, trying to sit up in bed. Sterling listened carefully to the driver's account of the precarious conditions in which the elderly man lived. The house was small and poorly maintained, with no proper food or medication. Mr. Monroe could barely get out of bed, weakened by the lack of adequate treatment. The girl's reaction was immediate, her eyes filling with hope for the first time since she woke up. She tried to speak, but the emotion made it difficult to form words. Sterling continued, his voice firm and determined. "And when you two are recovered, I have a proposal to make. I want to help you both have a better life." A new agitation took over the room, when the medical team came in to perform more tests. Opal, though still worried, seemed more at ease knowing her grandfather would be cared for. Sterling took the opportunity to make a few more calls, organizing Mr. Monroe's transfer and preparing the next steps. "Trust me," he said to the girl between one exam and another, "from now on you're no longer alone." The doctors discussed Opal's clinical condition among themselves, commenting on the need for a few more days of hospitalization. The girl listened to everything with apprehension, divided between concern for her own recovery and anxiety to see her grandfather. Sterling, realizing her dilemma, approached her bed again. A social worker arrived in the room, carrying a folder with documents. Sterling had called him to regularize the situation and ensure he could make the necessary decisions to help Opal and her grandfather. As they discussed the legal procedures, the girl watched everything with a mixture of fear and hope. "What's going to happen to us now?" she asked in a low voice, squeezing Sterling's hand again. The businessman looked at the small figure in the hospital bed, so fragile and yet so strong. He made his final decision at that moment. "You're going to my house as soon as you're discharged," he declared firmly. "I have plenty of space and can ensure you receive all the care you need." The tears that streamed down Opal's face now were no longer of fear or sadness, but of an emotion she could barely comprehend. A week had passed when the doctor finally signed Opal's discharge papers. The girl, still with some bandages and visible bruises, sat on the edge of the hospital bed while a nurse helped with the final preparations. Sterling had provided new clothes for her, but Opal insisted on keeping her old sandals in a bag, as if afraid of completely losing her identity. Watching her reflection in the window glass, she gently touched her face, still marked by the accident, and whispered to herself, "Am I dreaming?" Sterling stepped away to a corner of the room, phone in hand, taking a deep breath before making the call he had been postponing. His wife, Marion, still didn't know about his decision to bring Opal home. The words came cautiously out of his mouth as he explained the situation, trying to anticipate his wife's reaction. On the other end of the line, the prolonged silence made him increasingly tense. "Dear, I need you to understand. It's a matter of humanity," he argued, sensing the coolness in the response he received. The nurse finished organizing the discharge paperwork, handing over the last medications and care instructions. Opal watched everything with apprehensive eyes, her small hands never stopping playing with the hem of her new shirt. The fear of the unknown was stamped on her face, especially when she heard Sterling's tense voice on the phone. "What if his wife doesn't accept me?" she thought, feeling a knot forming in her throat. Sterling hung up the phone with a worried expression, but soon replaced it with an encouraging smile as he turned to Opal. His driver was already waiting with the car at the hospital entrance, and the doctors had assured Mr. Monroe would continue receiving the best treatment in the geriatric ward. Approaching the girl, he extended his hand in a protective gesture. "Ready to meet your new home, little one." The journey to the mansion was silent and tense. Opal kept her gaze fixed on the window of the luxurious car, watching the city gradually change as they entered an elegant neighborhood. Her thoughts were divided between gratitude towards Sterling and fear of what she would find in her new life. The businessman noticed her apprehension and tried to distract her with stories about the neighborhood, but realized the girl only responded with shy nods. "It's okay to be nervous," he said gently. "I'm a little anxious too." The imposing gate of the mansion opened slowly, revealing a meticulously tended garden. Opal felt her heart race as she saw the huge house that rose before her, so different from anything she knew. The car came to a smooth stop at the main entrance, where several employees were waiting in line. The girl clutched the bag with her old sandals against her chest, as if that object could give her courage. "It's so big," she muttered in awe. "It looks like a palace." Sterling helped Opal out of the car, noticing how she looked even smaller before the imposing facade of the mansion. The servants greeted her respectfully, but the girl could sense some curious and even distrustful glances. A butler approached to take the small bag she was carrying, but Opal refused to let it go. "It's my keepsakes," she explained softly, prompting Sterling to quickly intervene. "She can keep her belongings, Pablo." The entrance to the mansion was even more impressive inside, with its gleaming marble floors and crystal chandeliers. Opal walked hesitantly, fearing she might dirty the immaculate floor with her steps. Sterling gently guided her through the corridors decorated with works of art, explaining where each room was located. They reached a majestic staircase leading to the second floor when the sound of high heels echoed in the environment. "It must be Marion coming down to greet us," Sterling commented, his voice betraying a slight tension. Marion Thorne emerged at the top of the stairs like a vision of elegance and power. Her impeccable dress and haughty posture contrasted sharply with Opal's small and frail figure. Her eyes scanned the girl from head to toe, an indecipherable expression on her perfectly made-up face. Sterling climbed a few steps, extending his hand to his wife. "Darling, this is Opal, the girl I told you about." Time seemed to freeze as Marion descended the stairs with calculated movements. Opal felt a shiver run down her spine, a strange feeling of recognition starting to form in her mind. There was something familiar about this elegant woman, something that made her stomach churn with apprehension. Marion's eyes met hers, and for a moment, Opal swore she saw a flash of panic cross the lady of the house's face. Sterling, oblivious to the growing tension between the two, continued with the formal introductions. Marion forced a smile that didn't reach her eyes, extending a perfectly manicured hand toward Opal. The girl hesitated before accepting the greeting, feeling the woman's cold hand grip hers with unnecessary force. "Welcome to our home," said Marion, her voice as sweet as honey, but with an undertone that made Opal shudder. The moment was interrupted by a maid bringing a tray with tea and cookies. Marion quickly stepped away, gesturing toward the living room. But Opal remained paralyzed on the last step of the staircase, her memories finally fitting together like pieces of a macabre puzzle. That face, that voice. Images of a small restaurant began to invade her mind. Sterling noticed Opal's hesitation and came back to help her, interpreting her behavior as simple shyness. Marion had already headed to the living room, her rigid posture betraying some discomfort. The girl allowed Sterling to guide her, but her eyes didn't leave Marion's figure. "Impossible," she thought to herself. "It can't be her." Marion's next words were interrupted by a shrill sound of breaking porcelain. The tray with the tea set had slipped from the maid's hands, but it wasn't the noise that made everyone freeze. It was the expression on Marion's face as she finally recognized Opal completely. Her eyes widened, her skin lost all color, and before anyone could react, her body collapsed to the floor of the living room with a dull thud. "Marion!" Sterling shouted, running to help his wife. But Opal remained motionless, her heart racing as she watched the scene unfold. The memories were now as clear as crystal. The small restaurant. "It's her," she whispered to herself, feeling the weight of this secret crush her chest. The shrill sound of the siren cut through the silence of the affluent neighborhood, echoing between the imposing mansions on Polanco Street. The servants of the Calloway house were running in all directions, some opening the gates for the ambulance, others picking up the shattered porcelain shards from the living room floor. Opal remained still, watching Sterling support the unconscious Marion, while old memories of the small restaurant invaded her mind like painful flashes. The noise of the paramedics rushing in through the front door brought her back to reality, but her heart kept racing, divided between fear of the past and uncertainty about the present. "How can she be here?" she thought repeatedly, her hands gripping the bag with her old sandals even tighter. The paramedics worked with methodical efficiency, checking Marion's vital signs and asking Sterling quick questions about what happened. The businessman, visibly distraught, tried to remain calm as he explained his wife's sudden collapse. Opal noticed how he avoided mentioning the exact moment Marion recognized her, attributing it all to stress and fatigue. The medical team carefully transferred the lady of the house to the stretcher, their precise movements contrasting with the emotional chaos that hung in the air. One of the paramedics, adjusting Marion's cervical collar, frowned as she checked her blood pressure. "We need to take her to the hospital immediately, sir. Her blood pressure is very unstable." Sterling found himself torn between following the ambulance with his wife or staying with Opal, who wasn't yet fully familiar with the house and the servants. His gaze alternated between the frightened girl and his unconscious wife as his mind tried to find the best solution. The housekeeper, a middle-aged woman named Iris, sensing his dilemma, approached discreetly. Her years of service in the house gave her the confidence to suggest, "Sir, I can take care of the girl while you accompany Mrs. Marion. I promise she will be fine." It was at this moment that Marion began to briefly regain consciousness, her eyes opening with difficulty as the paramedics prepared her for transport. Her still unfocused gaze met Opal, who was standing near the stairs. For an instant, time seemed to freeze. The girl felt a chill run down her spine as she noticed the glint of recognition and panic in the eyes of the elegant woman who would now, theoretically, be her protector. Marion tried to say something, but her voice failed and her eyes closed again. "We need to go now," insisted the paramedic, starting to move the stretcher towards the exit. Sterling finally made his decision, quickly instructing Iris about taking care of Opal. The governess nodded, understanding the responsibility entrusted to her. Before leaving, the businessman approached the girl, kneeling down to be at eye level with her. His words were gentle, but Opal could sense the concern in his voice. "Little one, I need to go with Marion to the hospital. Iris will take good care of you, and I promise I'll be back as soon as possible. Is everything okay?" The girl simply nodded, unable to express the whirlwind of emotions she felt. The following hours at the hospital were tense. The doctors performed a series of tests on Marion, while Sterling anxiously awaited news in the waiting room. His mind was divided between concern for his wife and thoughts about Opal being alone at home. The preliminary results began to arrive, indicating a severe drop in blood pressure caused by intense stress. "Mr. Calloway," explained the doctor, adjusting his glasses, "your wife had a severe reaction, likely triggered by some strong emotional factor. Did you notice anything that could have caused such stress?" In the hospital room, Marion slowly regained consciousness, her eyes adjusting to the fluorescent light of the environment. Sterling was by her side, holding her hand as she tried to organize her thoughts. The fear and confusion on her face were evident, but there was something more, something she was desperately trying to hide. "Sterling," her voice came out weak, "the girl, why is she in our house?" The businessman attributed her concern to the shock of the situation, trying to reassure her with soothing words. "Dear, don't worry about that now. You need to rest." The medical team continued to monitor Marion's vital signs, which gradually stabilized. The attending physician, after another round of tests, confirmed that there was nothing serious beyond the low blood pressure episode. However, he recommended that she remain under observation for at least 24 hours. Sterling took this opportunity to call home, making sure Opal was okay. Iris's voice on the other end of the line reassured him. "The girl is calm, sir. She has already bathed and is having dinner now." When they were finally alone in the room, Marion seemed more composed, although still pale and visibly disturbed. Her fingers nervously played with the hem of the hospital sheet as she tried to find the right words. Sterling noticed her restlessness and moved closer, sitting on the edge of the bed. It was then that Marion, in a move that surprised him, grasped his hands tightly. "Sterling," she began, her voice trembling slightly, Maybe I can help with the girl when we get back home. You know, to make up for the scare today." Marion's suggestion caught Sterling off guard. He didn't expect his wife, always so reserved and focused on her social life, to offer to help with Opal. However, there was something in her tone of voice, a barely disguised urgency, that intrigued him. Still, the idea seemed promising. "Are you sure, dear?" "It would be wonderful, but I don't want you to feel pressured," he responded cautiously, studying her reaction. The smile Marion gave in response didn't reach her eyes. The next morning, the doctors performed the final evaluation on Marion before discharging her. Her blood pressure was normalized, and the tests didn't indicate any other complications. Sterling arranged for their return home, sending a message to Iris to prepare everything for their arrival. During the journey back, Marion maintained an artificial calm, her hands perfectly arranged in her lap, but her eyes betrayed an inner agitation that she tried to control. "I'm going to dedicate myself to making Opal feel at home," she declared softly, though her words carried a weight that Sterling couldn't comprehend. The car finally passed through the gates of the mansion, and Marion took a deep breath, as if gathering strength for what was to come. Opal was waiting at the main entrance with Iris, her small hands still clutching the bag with her old sandals. Their gazes met again, and for a brief moment a current of silent understanding passed between them. Marion was the first to break eye contact, forcing a sweet smile as she stepped out of the car. "Come here, dear," she called with a honeyed voice that made Opal shudder. "We're going to be great friends, you'll see." Sterling watched the interaction with relief, interpreting Marion's apparent kindness as a positive sign. However, Opal felt her heart racing for very different reasons. The girl knew she would need to keep this secret, at least for now, but the weight of this truth was already suffocating her. "Yes, ma'am," she responded mechanically, feeling the words scratching her throat. The rest of the day unfolded in an apparent, tense normality. Marion insisted on personally showing Opal the prepared room, her overly gentle gestures contrasting with the calculating glint in her eyes. Sterling, busy with some work calls in his office, didn't notice the nuances of this interaction. Little Opal, for her part, silently followed her new protector through the mansion's corridors, each step echoing as a reminder of the cruel fate that had placed the two under the same roof. "Here is your new home," announced Marion with false sweetness, opening the door to a luxurious room. "I hope we can get to know each other better. Much better." Sterling's office was immersed in the golden light of the sunset when the phone call arrived. The voice on the other end of the line was urgent, speaking about a crisis in the companies that demanded his immediate presence in Colorado. Marion, who was passing by the hallway at that moment, discreetly stopped to listen to the conversation, an almost imperceptible smile forming on her perfectly painted lips. Her plans were beginning to align perfectly. "I need to leave today," Sterling spoke on the phone, running his hands through his hair in a sign of concern. "We can't lose those investors." Opal observed all the commotion from the kitchen door, her heart tight with a bad premonition. In recent days, she had tried several times to be alone with Sterling to tell the truth about Marion, but her protector seemed to have eyes and ears everywhere in the mansion. The girl nervously clutched the hem of the new dress she was wearing, trying to gather courage for one last attempt before the trip. "I need to tell," she thought anxiously, "before it's too late." Sterling began hastily organizing his briefcase with important documents, while giving instructions by phone for his driver to prepare the car. Marion entered the office with soft steps, her presence filling the room with an expensive and suffocating perfume. "Darling, let me help with the luggage," she sweetly offered, positioning herself strategically between the door and her husband's desk. Her eyes, however, did not stop monitoring Opal's movements in the hallway. The girl took a deep breath and decided it was now or never. Taking advantage of a moment when Marion was distracted by organizing the suitcase, Opal timidly entered the office. "Mr. Sterling," her voice trembled slightly, "can I talk to you for just a minute? It's important." Before she could continue, Marion accidentally dropped a stack of papers, creating a commotion that demanded immediate attention. "Oh, how clumsy of me," she exclaimed with false regret. "Opal dear, can you help us pick everything up?" Time seemed to be running against Opal as she bent down to gather the scattered papers. Each attempt to approach Sterling was skillfully intercepted by Marion, who created small distractions or urgent tasks. The girl's anxiety grew with every minute, watching her chance to reveal the truth slip through her fingers like sand. "Mr. Sterling, please," she tried again. "I really need to—" Marion, perceiving Opal's persistence, decided to change tactics. With a maternal smile that did not reach her eyes, she interrupted the girl. "Sterling, darling, I think our little one is just anxious about your departure. Isn't that right, dear? Don't worry, I'll take very good care of her while you're away." Her words sounded sweet, but Opal could feel the veiled threat in every syllable. The driver arrived, announcing that the car was ready, increasing Sterling's hurry even more. He put the last documents in his briefcase, completely oblivious to the silent drama unfolding in his office. Opal felt tears forming in her eyes, desperate to find a way to alert him. "It's about the restaurant," she began to say, but Marion quickly enveloped her in a suffocating embrace. "Look, she's even crying about your departure." Sterling, moved by the apparent scene of affection between his wife and the girl, approached to say goodbye. Marion kept a firm arm around Opal's shoulders, her fingers lightly squeezing in a silent warning. "Take good care of our little one," Sterling asked, kissing his wife's forehead. The girl tried one last time, but Mr. Sterling, her father. Marion immediately interrupted her with a forced laugh. "Look, she's already considering us family." The businessman picked up his briefcase and walked towards the door, casting one last affectionate look at the two. Opal felt her heart beating so loud, she was sure everyone could hear it. The words were stuck in her throat, struggling to come out, while Marion's fingers kept pressing on her shoulder like disguised claws. "I'll be back in a few days," Sterling promised from the door. Behave, my two princesses. As soon as the sound of the car faded away through the mansion's gate, Marion abruptly let go of Opal. Her face, once sweet and maternal, transformed into a mask of cruelty. The girl took a few steps back, startled by the sudden change. "Look at you, you filthy beggar." Marion spat the words with utter contempt, her eyes sparking with hatred. "Do you really think anyone will believe a dirty pauper like you over me? Sterling will never choose a street rat over his wife. Now I'll teach you what place people like you have in this house, and it's not making accusations, it's scrubbing the floor like the scum you are." The silence that followed was deafening. Opal watched in terror as Marion slowly walked towards her, her high heels echoing on the marble floor like a countdown to the nightmare that was about to begin. "The first rule is simple, you little meddler." Marion grabbed Opal's chin with brutal force, her red nails touching the girl's delicate skin. "If you dare mention the restaurant or my father again, I won't need to soil my hands. Just one phone call, and your dear grandfather can have an accidental cardiac arrest during treatment. Is that clear, or do I need to be more specific?" A solitary tear rolled down Opal's cheek as she nodded silently. The sun had completely set now, leaving the office in the dim light, illuminated only by the faint glow of Sterling's desk lamp. Marion smiled, a cold smile that made the girl shiver. "Good," she said softly, "because if you tell anything, well, it would be a shame if something happened to your dear grandpa in the hospital, wouldn't it?" Opal's last ray of hope faded with the daylight. She was alone now, trapped in a luxurious mansion with a woman she knew all too well, whose dark past threatened to destroy not only her new life, but also the only family she had left. "Now," Marion commanded, her voice as sharp as a razor, "go to your room. We have much to do in the coming days, and you will learn exactly what your place is in this house." The California International Airport lobby buzzed with activity as Sterling bid a hurried farewell to Marion and Opal. The girl watched helplessly as the businessman's final moments before departure, feeling as though she were witnessing her last chance at salvation aboard that plane. Marion kept a perfect smile on her lips as she waved to her husband, her free hand discreetly gripping Opal's shoulder hard enough to leave marks. "If you open that filthy mouth one more time," Marion whispered with venom in every word, her fingers lightly gripping Opal's throat like claws, "I'll make sure your grandfather has a slow and painful end in that hospital. First the wrong medicines, then a mysterious infection, and you'll watch every minute of his suffering, knowing it's all your fault." The return to the mansion was marked by a suffocating silence. As soon as the car crossed the gates, Marion's mask of kindness disappeared completely. Her face, once sweet and maternal, transformed into an expression of utter contempt. Turning to Opal in the back seat, her voice came out razor-sharp. "Listen very closely, you little street rat," Marion growled, pressing Opal against the wall. "When my guests arrive, you vanish like the trash you are. If anyone so much as dreams there's a beggar living here, I'll make sure your grandfather has an accidental morphine overdose today. And believe me, I can make it look very natural." Opal, cowering, merely nodded silently. But that wasn't enough for Marion. With a sudden movement, she grabbed the girl's chin, forcing her to look into her eyes. The fear she saw reflected there seemed to satisfy her momentarily. Releasing the girl's face with a movement of revulsion, she continued, "If I catch you near a phone." Marion gripped Opal's throat until she almost lost her breath, her eyes gleaming with pure cruelty. "I'll make your grandfather suffer so much in that hospital that death will seem like mercy. First the wrong medicines, then a mysterious infection, and you'll watch every second of his agony knowing you caused it with your own hands." Upon entering the mansion, Marion dismissed all the staff for 2 hours, ensuring there would be no witnesses to what was about to happen. She dragged Opal to the kitchen, where several dirty pots from the night before were piled up. The girl watched silently as her tormentor opened cabinets and drawers, gathering cleaning products. "Since you want so badly to live in this house," she said with a cruel smile, "you'll learn to work for it. Start by washing everything, and don't you dare stop until every pot is shining." The following hours were a nightmare of forced labor. Opal's small hands, unaccustomed to harsh chemicals, began to burn and turn red. Marion supervised every movement, criticizing any imperfection mercilessly. When the girl tried to take a break to drink water, she was met with a sarcastic laugh. "Water, you filthy brat," Marion laughed cruelly. Beggars like you should drink from the toilet you're cleaning. If you're thirsty, you can lick the floor you just scrubbed. That is, if you're not too busy begging for food in the streets like the trash you are. The sun was already setting when Marion finally allowed Opal to stop with the pots. But instead of the expected rest, she dragged the exhausted girl to the back bathroom. "There's a persistent stain on the floor that's been bothering me," she declared, tossing a scrub brush at the child's feet. Silent tears began to stream down Opal's face as she knelt on the cold floor. "Please," she whispered. "I'm so tired." The slap she received in response echoed off the bathroom walls. Iris, the housekeeper, returned to the mansion at that moment and sensed something amiss. She found Opal kneeling in the bathroom, scrubbing the floor with trembling hands, while Marion supervised with perverse pleasure. Before she could intervene, her employer intercepted her in the hallway. She asked to help with the cleaning. "She's learning to be useful. And you, Iris, pretend you didn't see anything, you meddling old bat," Marion hissed with a threatening smile, cornering Iris against the wall. "And that little house you live in? I can have you all out on the street tomorrow. Now get out of my sight before I decide I need a more discreet housekeeper." Night fell over the mansion, bringing not rest, but more work. Marion seemed tireless in her cruelty, always finding one more task, one more surface to clean. Opal could barely stand, her legs trembling with exhaustion. When she was finally sent to her room, she discovered her dinner would be nothing but a stale piece of bread. "Be grateful for that," Marion mocked from the doorway. "There are children far hungrier out on the streets." In the solitude of her room, Opal let the tears flow freely. Her thoughts constantly returned to her grandfather in the hospital, the only reason she endured this cruel treatment. Through the window, she could see the light on in Sterling's office, where the telephone sat temptingly on the desk. "I have to endure," she whispered to herself. "I have to protect my grandfather." At midnight, Marion paid one last visit to Opal's room. She found the girl huddled on the bed, still wearing her soiled clothes from the day. With a satisfied smile, she left a note on the nightstand, the schedule of chores for the next day beginning at 5 in the morning. "Sleep well, dear," she said with false sweetness. "There's much more work waiting for you tomorrow." That night, as the mansion sank into silence, two different kinds of tears were shed. In the main bedroom, Marion cried with rage as she remembered her past in the small restaurant, swearing that she would make Opal pay for every painful memory her presence brought to the surface. In the back room, Opal cried with fear and exhaustion, praying that Sterling would return soon or that by some miracle, someone would discover the truth before it was too late. The next few days promised to be even worse. Marion was already planning new forms of psychological torture, new degrading tasks, new humiliations. Opal, in turn, tried to gather strength to face what was to come, clinging to the memory of her grandfather as her only source of hope. The Calloway mansion, which should have been a refuge, had become her personal prison, and her jailer was the last person she expected to find in this new life. After 3 days of forced labor and constant humiliation, Opal finally saw her opportunity. Marion was in the garden, supervising the pruning of the rose bushes, completely distracted by her orders to the gardeners. The girl, who had just finished cleaning the kitchen floor for the 3rd time that day, observed Sterling's empty office through the half-open door. The telephone on the mahogany desk seemed to beckon her, promising salvation. With silent steps and trembling hands, she slid into the forbidden room. "Please, God, help me," she whispered, picking up the handset with fingers hurt by cleaning products. Sterling's cell phone number was written on a paper attached to the agenda next to the phone. Opal dialed quickly, her heart beating so hard it felt like it would explode. Each ring sounded like an eternity as her eyes never left the office door. Sterling's familiar grave voice on the other end of the line almost made her cry with relief. "Hello? Who's speaking?" Swallowing the lump in her throat, she began, "Mr. Sterling." A dull thud interrupted her. Marion was standing in the office doorway, her eyes flashing with contained fury. The phone was violently ripped from Opal's hands. The call was abruptly cut off when Marion disconnected the handset's cord. The ensuing silence was more frightening than any scream. The elegant woman breathed heavily, her perfectly manicured fingers gripping the phone cord so tightly that her knuckles turned white. "You really haven't learned anything, have you?" Marion's voice came out as a dangerous hiss as she slowly closed the office door. Opal backed up until she hit the bookshelf, knocking down a few volumes in the process. The sound of the falling books seemed to awaken something even darker in her tormentor. "Do you know what happens to little liars who don't know their place?" Marion continued, advancing like a predator cornering its prey. Opal's eyes frantically scanned the office for an escape route, but Marion blocked the only exit, and the windows were too high. The girl could see her terrified reflection in the wall mirror. Disheveled hair, deep dark circles, clothes stained with cleaning products. "Please," she tried to argue, "Mr. Sterling needs to know the truth about what happened to his father." The slap Marion delivered to the desk made Opal stumble backwards. Marion grabbed Opal's arm, dragging her out of the office. Her fury was controlled, calculated, which made it even more frightening. Going up the stairs, she practically carried the girl to her room, ignoring her protests and pleas. "You want to talk about my past so badly, you street rat?" Marion held Opal's face like a predator. "Then I'll give you a taste of the hell I lived in that restaurant, and believe me, I'll make you beg to depart from this world before I'm done." The room that once seemed a dream of luxury would now become a prison. Marion threw Opal onto the bed with force, methodically searching the environment. She found a small hidden cell phone under the pillow, a secret gift from Iris, the housekeeper, and crushed it under the heel of her Italian boot. "No communication," she declared coldly. "No food, no water until you learn to keep that sewer mouth shut." The sound of the key turning in the lock echoed like a final sentence. Opal ran to the door, pounding on the solid wood with her small fists, but it was useless. On the other side, she could hear Marion giving orders to the employees. No one was to approach that room under any circumstance. "And what about my grandfather?" Opal cried out in desperation. "You promised not to harm him." A cruel laugh was her only initial answer. Then Marion's voice came through the door with false sweetness. "Oh dear, your grandfather is perfectly fine, Asa, for now. But you know how dangerous hospitals can be, don't you? So many different medications, so many possibilities for accidents." The sound of high heels walking away down the hallway left Opal sinking to the floor, hugging her knees in despair. The hours dragged on endlessly in the locked room. The sun was beginning to set, painting the walls in shades of orange that seemed to mock the girl's situation. Opal alternated between moments of silent crying and frustrated attempts to find a way out. In her mind, she repeated like a mantra the part of the message she managed to pass on to Sterling, praying it would be enough to arouse some suspicion in him. Downstairs, Marion was in her element, meticulously planning her revenge. Seated at her vanity, she applied another layer of red lipstick while mentally organizing her next steps. The phone rang. It was Sterling, worried about the interrupted call. With a mellifluous voice, she explained it had just been an accident, that Opal was playing with the phone and dropped it. "Everything is perfectly fine, dear," she lied softly. "Our little one is just learning how to behave." In the growing darkness of the room, Opal approached the window, observing the city lights that were beginning to turn on. Her stomach ached with hunger, her throat burned with thirst, but nothing compared to the pain of the fear she felt. Somewhere in that same city, her grandfather was in the hospital, completely vulnerable to Marion's whims. The girl leaned her forehead against the cold glass, letting out a whispered plea. "Please, Mr. Sterling, understand my message. Please come back soon." Marion went up the stairs again, stopping in front of the locked door. She could hear Opal's muffled sobs from the other side, and a cruel smile formed on her perfectly painted lips. "Enjoy your night of reflection, darling," she spoke loud enough to be heard. "Tomorrow we have a very special day planned. I'm going to teach you to serve my society friends, exactly as I served at my father's restaurant." The terrified silence that followed was music to her ears. The sun had not yet risen when Marion burst into Opal's room, dragging the girl out of bed by her hair. The purple marks from the previous day, still visible on her arms, contrasted with her tormentor's elegant dress. The first day of punishment after the attempted call to Sterling promised to be particularly cruel. Opal, staggering with weakness after 24 hours without food or water, was pushed downstairs towards the kitchen. "Time to work, street rat," Marion hissed with perverse satisfaction. "And today I'm going to teach you the true meaning of pain." Opal's knees trembled as she tried to balance the pile of dirty dishes from the previous dinner. Marion had purposefully left all the dishes to accumulate, mixing food scraps with the plates just to make the task more degrading. The smell of spoiled food made the girl's empty stomach churn, but she dared not show weakness. "How pathetic," Marion mocked, dropping more plates into the sink. "Are you hungry? Maybe I should let you lick the plates before washing them." Darius, the family's driver, watched the scene from the garage door with a mixture of horror and helplessness. His years of loyal service to the Callaways had never prepared him to witness such cruelty. He saw when Opal, dehydrated and starving, tried discreetly to drink some water from the faucet. Marion's reaction was instant and brutal. "You filthy pig!" she screamed, pulling the girl by her hair. "Do you think you deserve to drink clean water? If you're thirsty, you can drink the dirty dishwater." The hours dragged on like an eternity of torture. After the kitchen, Marion forced Opal to clean every bathroom in the mansion with a tiny toothbrush. The strong smell of the chemicals made her eyes burn and her head spin, but there was no permission for breaks or rest. "Can you smell the chemicals, princess?" Marion taunted, kicking the bucket of dirty water so that Opal would have to clean it all over again. "I hope your lungs are burning as much as mine burned at my father's restaurant." Noon sun blazed through the enormous windows when Marion assigned the next task, polishing all the house's silverware. Hundreds of pieces were scattered across the dining room floor, and Opal was forced to clean each one on her knees. Her fingers, already marked by the chemicals, left stains on the cleaning cloths. "If you stain my silverware with your filthy sweat," Marion threatened, "I'll make you clean it all with your tongue." Darius could no longer bear to witness the girl's suffering. During his lunch break, he discreetly approached Opal with a piece of bread and a bottle of water hidden in his uniform. The look of gratitude in the child's eyes almost made him cry. But before he could deliver the food, Marion's cutting voice froze them both in place. Well, how touching." Marion's voice cut through the air like a poisoned blade, freezing them both in place. Her heels echoed like a harbinger of death as she approached, a cruel smile playing on her perfectly painted lips. "You know, Darius, your children are so vulnerable at school. It would be a tragedy if something happened to them walking home, or if that scholarship suddenly disappeared. And that house where you live? So dangerous living on the street these days, especially with 3 kids. Her fingers caressed her phone menacingly. "Do you really want to find out how long your kids would survive on the streets because of this filthy rat?" The afternoon brought new tortures. Marion forced Opal to clean the exterior windows of the second floor, making her balance precariously on a narrow ledge. The fear of falling mixed with extreme exhaustion, making the girl tremble uncontrollably. "It would be a shame if you fell, wouldn't it?" Marion taunted, purposefully shaking the ladder. "But don't worry, I'll tell Sterling it was a sad accident." The sun was beginning to set when Marion announced the final task of the day, organizing the massive closet where she kept her collection of imported shoes. Opal could barely keep her eyes open, her vision blurring from severe dehydration. Still, she was forced to clean and organize hundreds of pairs of shoes, each one worth more than she would ever see in her life. "Do you know how much each pair costs?" Marion asked, purposefully stepping on the girl's bruised hands with her stiletto heel. "More than your miserable life is worth." It was already night when Opal finally finished the last task. Her entire body trembled with exhaustion, and dark spots danced in her vision. Her last strength abandoned her, and she passed out, falling heavily to the floor of one of the rooms. Marion watched the scene with a cruel smile, making no move to help. "So weak," she murmured with disdain, "just like the pathetic customers who frequented my father's restaurant." From the outside of the closet, Darius heard everything with a broken heart. His hands gripped the steering wheel of the car as he made a decision that could cost him his job and his family's future. In his pocket, the cell phone weighed like lead, holding Sterling's emergency number. "May God forgive me," he whispered to himself, "but I can no longer remain silent." The opportunity Darius had been waiting for arose when Marion left for her lunch with friends at the club. The driver had kept a sandwich and a bottle of water tucked into his uniform, planning every move with the care of someone who knows they are risking everything. He found Opal in the laundry room, practically fainting as she tried to carry laundry baskets larger than herself. Her hands were trembling so much she could barely hold the sheets, and her parched lips were slightly bleeding. "Quick, little one," he whispered, extending the food. "Eat before she returns." Opal devoured the sandwich in seconds, tears silently rolling down her bruised face as she drank the water as if it were the most precious thing in the world. Her fingers could barely hold the bottle. Darius felt his heart tighten at the sight of the girl's condition, the marks on her arms, the deep, dark circles, her small body trembling with exhaustion. "Why does she hate you so much?" he asked softly, helping Opal sit on a pile of clean sheets. The sound of heels in the hallway made the two freeze. It was too late. Marion had returned early and overheard part of the conversation. Her face, normally controlled in a mask of elegance, was contorted in an expression of murderous fury. "What a touching scene!" Her voice cut through the air like a razor, the driver and the beggar sharing little secrets. "I must assume this is not the first time, is it, Darius?" The driver tried to explain himself, but Marion cut him off with an abrupt gesture. Her eyes flashed with calculated cruelty as she approached, each step echoing like a death sentence. "You know, Darius," Marion whispered with venom in every word, her eyes gleaming with murderous cruelty, "it would be a tragedy if your children suffered an accident coming home from school. The streets are so dangerous these days. And they say children recover so poorly from being run over. Look at our little rat here. I can only imagine a father's pain at seeing his own children suffering in a hospital bed." Darius's face instantly paled. His hands began to tremble as images of his 3 children flashed through his mind. The oldest about to enter university, the younger twins finally settled in private school. Marion smiled, knowing she had struck his weak spot. "And that comfortable house where you live. Sterling's property, if I'm not mistaken. I can only imagine how hard it would be to find a new place on a driver's salary." Opal watched the scene unfold with growing horror, realizing she was about to lose her only ally in the house. She tried to take a step towards Darius, but Marion grabbed her by the hair, violently pulling her back. "As for you, you little gossip," she hissed through clenched teeth, "we're going to have a talk about the price of sharing stories that don't belong to you." The driver felt his world crumbling as Marion continued listing everything his family would lose if he kept helping Opal. His children's school, the house, the job, all the stability he had built over years of work could disappear with a single word from her to Sterling. 3 days, Marion stated coldly. "That's how long you have to find another job before I decide I need a more obedient driver." Silent tears streamed down Darius's face as he stared at Opal, guilt and fear waging a battle in his heart. The girl tried to smile, even with Marion still cruelly gripping her hair. "It's okay," she whispered. "I don't want your children to suffer because of me." Marion released Opal with a violent shove, making her fall onto the pile of dirty sheets. Her smile was that of a predator that had just cornered its prey. "What a touching moment," she mocked. "But now that we've resolved this little loyalty issue, I think our little guest needs to learn a few more lessons about discretion." Darius hung his head in defeat and began walking towards the door. His steps were heavy, carrying the weight of the cowardice that fear for his family forced him to commit. Before leaving, he cast one last look at Opal, who was now being dragged by Marion towards the basement. "Forgive me," he murmured, so low that almost no one heard. The sound of the laundry room door closing echoed like a funeral bell. Opal was once again alone with her torturer, who now had even more reasons to be cruel. Marion dragged the girl down the hallways, her voice a venomous whisper. "Let's see if after today you still feel like telling stories from the past to anyone." Darius's last words before getting into his car were a silent prayer, mixed with the weight of remorse. "May God forgive me for being such a coward." The sound of the engine starting muffled the first screams coming from the mansion. After Darius's departure, the silence in the mansion became even more suffocating. Opal dragged herself through the empty hallways like a ghost, her body covered in fresh bruises from the latest punishment in the basement. The servants, terrified by the example made of the driver, now averted their gaze when they saw her, fearing the same fate if they showed any compassion. Marion had achieved her goal. The girl was completely isolated. Cleaning the windows of the main room, Opal watched the vacant spot in the garage where Darius's car used to be, feeling the weight of loneliness crushing her chest. "Now I only have myself." The morning dragged on with increasingly degrading tasks when Opal was sent to the kitchen to clean the oven. Marion had gone out shopping, leaving strict orders for the girl not to stop working until her return. It was then that, While scrubbing the oven racks with her already raw hands, Opal noticed something that made her heart race, a cordless phone forgotten on the kitchen counter. Her hands shook as she looked at the device, painfully remembering the consequences of her last attempt to ask for help. But maybe this is my last chance, she thought, feeling the adrenaline coursing through her veins. With silent steps, Opal approached the phone, her ears alert for any sound indicating Marion's return. Sterling's number was still etched in her memory from previous attempts. Her injured fingers quickly dialed, each touch on the line seeming like an eternity. "Please answer," she whispered desperately. "Please, I need to tell you everything." Sterling's deep voice on the other end of the line almost made Opal collapse in tears of relief. But before she could speak, she heard the sound of high heels rapidly approaching from the back entrance. Panic took over her body as she tried to communicate as much as possible in the little time she had. "Mr. Sterling, help! Your wife, she worked at the restaurant." The words were brutally cut off when Marion snatched the phone from her hands, ending the call with a devilish smile. Marion seemed possessed by a supernatural fury, her eyes blazing with murderous hatred. "You really don't learn, do you?" she whispered, forcing Opal towards the scalding steam from the nearby stove. "Maybe you need a more permanent lesson." The phone began to ring insistently, Sterling returning the interrupted call. Marion kept Opal immobilized with one hand while answering with the other, her voice instantly transforming into honey. "Sterling, darling. No, it was nothing important." The little one dropped the phone while cleaning the kitchen. "Everything is perfectly fine." Her fingers tightened around Opal's neck with increasing force as she spoke, making it clear that the price of contradiction would be too high. As soon as she hung up, Marion dragged Opal through the hallways to her luxurious bedroom. She threw the girl to the floor violently, beginning to rummage through her drawers with manic energy. "You seem to not understand your position in this house," she declared, grabbing a sharp pair of scissors from her vanity. "So I'll have to be more creative with your next punishment." The glint of the scissors in the afternoon light made Opal shrink against the wall, her body shaking uncontrollably. Marion approached with slow, calculated steps, savoring the terror in her eyes. "But first," she whispered with false sweetness, "I need you presentable for my party tomorrow. After all, what kind of hostess would I be if I didn't showcase my newest employee?" Retrieving a simple black dress from one of the drawers, Marion threw it at Opal's feet in contempt. It was a maid's uniform, purposefully too small to further humiliate her. "Tomorrow I'll be receiving the most important ladies of Mexican society," she announced with a cruel smile. "And you'll be serving them all. Every drink, every canapé, will be your chance to show you know your place." The sound of the scissors cutting through the air made Opal scream, but Marion only laughed, cutting a lock of her hair. "First, let's fix this deplorable appearance," she declared, continuing to cut the girl's hair in an uneven, humiliating manner. "I can't have a scruffy little beggar serving my guests, can I?" As she cut Opal's hair, Marion detailed her plans for the party with perverse pleasure. Each assigned task was more humiliating than the last, each rule crueler, each threat more explicit. "And if you dare make a scene," she warned, gripping the girl's bruised face tightly, "I guarantee it will be the last time your grandfather receives his medication at the hospital." The preparations for the party began immediately. Opal was forced to clean the main hall multiple times, set the tables, polish the silver cutlery, all while Marion supervised her every move with hawk-like eyes. The sun was already setting when the first phase of preparations ended, leaving the girl exhausted and terrified of what the following day held in store. In the solitude of her room, looking at her mutilated reflection in the mirror, Opal tried to gather her last bit of strength. Her hair, once long and beautiful, was now cut in a grotesque, uneven manner. But it wasn't just the physical marks that made her cry. It was the certainty that the next day would be the worst of all. "Please, Mr. Sterling," she prayed silently, "understand my message before it's too late." Outside the room, Marion was making one last phone call. Her smile was that of a predator planning the final blow, as she confirmed the presence of her cruelest, most prejudiced guests. "Yes, dear," she whispered into the phone, "tomorrow will be a truly unforgettable day." The Callaway mansion shone like a brilliant jewel on that afternoon, decorated with extravagant flower arrangements and imported crystals. Opal, wearing the tight, humiliating black uniform, her hair brutally cut, moved among the final preparations like a terrified shadow. Marion oversaw every detail with hawk-like eyes, occasionally stopping to purposefully and painfully adjust something in the girl's appearance. "Remember," she whispered, digging her nails into Opal's bruised arm, "one mistake and your grandfather suffers the consequences." The first guests began to arrive, a parade of expensive jewelry and imported perfumes. Marion greeted them with rehearsed smiles, introducing Opal as her newest charity case. The ladies of Mexican high society barely hid their disdain, whispering among themselves as they watched the girl serve drinks with trembling hands. "Darling, where did you find this creature?" one of them asked with false sweetness, deliberately spilling her glass for Opal to clean up. The main hall quickly filled with 20 of the most influential and cruel women in the city. Their laughter echoed like sharp knives every time Opal passed by, their malicious comments growing louder and more direct. One of them, wearing a diamond necklace that could feed a family for years, purposefully stuck out her foot when the girl walked by with a heavy tray. "Oops," she laughed as the canapes scattered across the floor. "It seems she's not used to civilized environments." Marion watched it all with perverse satisfaction, occasionally adding her own cruel remarks to the humiliation. She made Opal kneel to clean up every crumb from the floor, while narrating a distorted version of how she found her. "Just imagine, ladies," her voice dripped with sweet venom, "the poor thing was literally rummaging through our trash." Sterling insisted on helping, but of course some people simply don't know their place. The hours dragged on like an endless torture. Each tray Opal carried seemed heavier than the last, her arms trembling with exhaustion and hunger. Marion had forbidden any food before or during the event. The ladies' comments grew bolder, some suggesting solutions for dealing with that kind of people. "You know, Marion," one of them commented, sipping her champagne, "in my day, we knew how to teach good manners to rebellious servants." Evelyn Lennox, the cruelest of the guests, observed everything with particular interest. Her shrewd eyes didn't miss a single movement from Marion or Opal, noticing the poorly concealed marks of violence under the girl's uniform. While the others laughed and mocked openly, she maintained a calculated silence, her mind working on plans of her own. "What an interesting story," she murmured to herself, discreetly taking her phone out of her Italian designer purse. The height of humiliation came when Marion announced that Opal would demonstrate her artistic talents. She forced the girl to sing a traditional Mexican song, knowing she could barely speak out of fear and exhaustion. The ladies' laughter and jeers echoed through the hall as Opal tried, with a trembling voice, to complete the forced performance. "What a disappointment," Marion sighed theatrically. "It seems she's not even good for entertainment." Silent tears streamed down Opal's face as she continued serving, each step a battle against the dizziness caused by hunger and fatigue. One of the guests, satisfied with the display of cruelty, whispered something in Marion's ear that made her eyes gleam with renewed wickedness. "But the afternoon is just beginning, darlings," she announced with a predatory smile. "Wait until you see what else I've prepared for our little special guest." Evelyn Lennox stood out among the guests, not only for her most expensive jewelry or most elegant dress, but mainly for the calculating gleam in her eyes as she watched Marion flaunt her power over Opal. Years of barely concealed envy of the hostess's social position had sharpened her instincts for detecting weaknesses, and something about this situation didn't seem right. She approached Marion with studied steps, her sweet voice hiding venom. "Darling, I must admit I'm utterly curious about this charity case of yours." Darius, working his last day as a driver, watched the scene from the hallway with a heavy heart. He had been ordered to remain on standby for any needs of the guests, forced to witness every humiliation inflicted upon Opal. He saw when Evelyn began her subtle interrogation, noticing how Marion's fingers gripped her crystal glass with increasing force. "It's such an interesting story," Evelyn continued, her eyes never leaving the hostess's face. "Sterling has always been known for his kindness, but taking in a beggar? There must be more to this tale." Marion kept her perfect smile, but a slight tremor in her hand betrayed her discomfort with the insistent questions. Her response came laden with calculated prejudice, every word chosen to arouse the contempt of the other guests. "Oh, darling, you know how those street people are. Completely savage, without the slightest notion of civility." Sterling, with his soft heart, insisted on helping after the little rat tried to steal his wallet. I imagine it's some kind of social experiment of his." The explanation provoked malicious laughter among the guests, but Evelyn merely arched her perfectly lined eyebrow. Her shrewd eyes caught the marks on Opal's arms when the girl served more champagne, also noticing the tremor of exhaustion in her small hands. "Fascinating," she murmured, discreetly taking out her phone. "And how long exactly has she been learning civility with you?" Darius noticed the subtle shift in the atmosphere, Evelyn's interrogation slowly exposing cracks in Marion's perfect facade. From his post in the hallway, he could see Opal struggling to remain standing, her legs faltering with each new step. The remorse for his earlier cowardice weighed even heavier as he witnessed the cruelty of that afternoon. "God forgive me," he thought, anguished, "for not doing more to help." Evelyn continued her veiled attack, now surrounded by other equally curious guests. Her questions, seemingly innocent, carried a weight that made Marion grow increasingly tense. "And what does Sterling think of your educational methods? Surely he approves of the way you're civilizing the girl." Marion's smile faltered for a moment, her perfectly manicured nails leaving marks on her palm from clenching her fist so tightly. The tension reached its peak when Opal stumbled, nearly dropping a tray of priceless glasses. Marion reacted with barely contained violence, grabbing the girl's arm with brutal force. The moment didn't go unnoticed by Evelyn, who discreetly photographed the scene with her phone. The other guests laughed at the situation, but their eyes recorded every detail with growing interest. "Impressive how you managed to keep your calm with this." "Savage," Evelyn goaded, savoring Marion's visible discomfort. With a discreet motion, Evelyn stepped away from the main group, her fingers rapidly typing a message on her cell phone. To any observer, she appeared merely another bored socialite checking her social media. But the text she was composing was far more dangerous. An anonymous, detailed tip about suspected child abuse at the Calloway mansion, including the freshly taken photo as evidence. With a satisfied smile, she sent the message directly to Sterling's personal number. Completely oblivious to the ticking time bomb that had just been activated, Marion continued her display of cruelty. But now there was a far more attentive audience, observing her every move, every exaggerated reaction, every display of barely contained violence. Evelyn tucked her phone back into her designer purse, her eyes glinting with malicious anticipation. "Darling," she called with false concern, "I think your ward might not be feeling well. Perhaps we should call for Sterling to help." In his office in Colorado, Sterling watched the screen of his cell phone with an increasingly somber expression. The anonymous tip and the attached photo made his blood boil. The image showed Marion violently grabbing onto Opal. The bruises visible on the girl's arms undeniable, even in the shaky photo. His hands began to tremble as more messages came in, short videos showing moments from the party, each one revealing a new layer of cruelty. "My God," he muttered to himself, "what is happening in my home?" The businessman immediately cancelled all remaining appointments, his voice shaking with rage as he called his private pilot. The words of the anonymous tip echoed in his mind, connecting with the strange interrupted phone calls of the past few days. Opal's desperate attempts to speak with him, always thwarted by conveniently timed accidents, now made a terrible sense. "Ready the plane," he ordered curtly. "I need to return to California immediately." At the mansion, the party continued its course of cruelty. Marion, drunk on power and champagne, failed to notice the exchanged glances between the guests every time she tormented Opal. Evelyn circulated among the groups, planting seeds of doubt with seemingly innocent comments. "Notice how the girl trembles when Marion approaches? Curious, isn't it?" Her phone kept stealthily sending evidence to Sterling, documenting each new abuse. The sky over California began to darken with storm clouds, reflecting the atmosphere inside the mansion. Oblivious to the approaching tempest, Marion carried on with her cruelty. She forced Opal to kneel and clean up spilled wine, provoking increasingly uncomfortable comments from the guests. The girl, however, sensed something different in the air, the looks of pity replacing those of scorn, the whispers changing in tone. Something is shifting, she thought, allowing herself a small flicker of hope. Sterling's private jet cut through the dark skies towards the capital. As he reread each message he'd received, the macabre puzzle was coming together with each new piece of information. His mind kept returning to the moment when Opal had tried to tell him something about a restaurant before being brutally cut off. "What else were you trying to tell me, little one?" he murmured, feeling the weight of guilt for his blindness. Evelyn watched her handiwork unfold with cruel satisfaction. Not only had she managed to plant the seeds of Marion's destruction, but she had ensured her downfall would be public and humiliating. Each guest leaving the party carried with them evidence of the horror they'd witnessed, ready to spread the scandal through all of Mexican high society. "Darling," she called with false concern, "perhaps we should call Sterling. The girl does look quite unwell." The deep rumble of thunder began to echo through the city, making the mansion's windows vibrate. Opal, now barely able to stand, saw Darius receive a call that made him pale. The driver looked directly at her for the first time that afternoon, his eyes carrying a silent message of hope. On the other end of the line, Sterling's voice was clipped. "Darius, I want you and Opal waiting at the gate in 20 minutes. Don't let Marion catch on to anything." The last of the guests were starting to take their leave as the first raindrops hit the mansion's windows. Marion, drunk on her apparent triumph, failed to notice the cold smiles and judgmental looks being directed her way. Her focus was solely on planning new torments for Opal, completely oblivious to the fact that her reign of terror was about to end. "The night's not over yet, darling," she whispered to the exhausted girl. "I have so many plans for you." Meanwhile, in the stormy skies above, Sterling's plane was beginning its final approach. His hands gripped the armrests with force, each minute seeming an eternity. The fury in his heart grew proportionally to the raging storm outside, fueled by each new video, each new piece of evidence he received. The image of the kindly protector had transformed. Now he was a man consumed by rage, ready to punish those who had abused his trust. The last thunderclap shook the mansion with special force, a portent of the chaos about to be unleashed. Darius discreetly began moving closer to Opal, ready to execute Sterling's instructions. The girl felt her heart rate quicken as she noticed the shift in the driver's demeanor, a thread of hope finally emerging amidst the despair. Marion, celebrating her apparent victory with another glass of champagne, failed to notice when her phone buzzed with a short, definitive message. "I'm coming back, and I know everything." The storm still raged over California when Sterling locked himself in his office the following morning. The evidence of the abuse against Opal had planted a seed of doubt that now grew like a weed, making him question everything about his wife. With fingers trembling with restrained fury, he began combing through every company document, every financial report from the past few months. Marion had been administering part of the business during his trips, and now that trust seemed an open door to disaster. "How could I have been so blind?" he muttered to himself, opening yet another folder of documents. The first discoveries came as hard blows to his stomach. Suspicious transfers, overpriced contracts, ghost suppliers, an elaborate embezzlement scheme that explained why his companies were on the brink of bankruptcy. In every document, Marion's elegant signature appeared as a silent confession of betrayal. Sterling felt his world crumbling as the evidence piled up, each new discovery more shocking than the last. All this time, she was robbing me, he thought bitterly, his hands gripping the papers tightly enough to almost tear them. A pattern began to emerge among the documents, large sums of money being diverted to a specific account, starting precisely when Marion took greater control of the business. The businessman urgently called his trusted accountant, demanding a thorough investigation. Each new report revealed more irregularities, more fraud, more betrayals. The anger in his chest grew proportionally to the discoveries. "I want to know where every penny went," he ordered in a cutting voice, "every transfer, every suspicious movement." As the numbers told their tale of betrayal, Sterling couldn't get Opal's broken words about a restaurant out of his head. Something about that mention seemed to be the key to an even greater mystery. With the help of his private investigator, he began to unearth Marion's past. The first discoveries were surprising. No record of a previous lavish life, no evidence of the noble origin she so boasted about. Only mentions of a small family restaurant in the city's suburbs. "Look into everything about that establishment," he instructed the investigator. "I want every detail of her life before she met me." The clock was almost noon when Sterling finally called Opal to the office. The girl entered cautiously, still hurt from the party the day before, her eyes downcast and frightened. But there was something different in her posture, a small glimmer of hope, fueled by the change she had sensed in the air since her protector's sudden return. Sterling closed the door carefully, his voice gentler than ever. "Little one, I need you to tell me everything about the restaurant you mentioned. Don't be afraid. Marion can't hurt you anymore." Tears began to stream down Opal's face as she finally allowed herself to speak. The story came in painful waves. The little restaurant where Marion worked as a waitress, her devoted, sick father, the humiliations she endured from customers. Sterling listened to every word with renewed attention, the pieces of the puzzle finally fitting together. Her father. He trusted her so much, Opal sobbed, and she sold everything, left him to depart alone and in misery. The impact of the revelation struck Sterling like a thunderbolt. The suspicious transfers, the scam at the restaurant, the abandonment of her own father, it was all part of a pattern of calculated cruelty he had been unable to see. His face hardened with controlled fury as he stood up, his decision already made. "Thank you for your courage, little one," he said softly. "Now I need to have a very serious conversation with my wife." The story Opal told made Sterling's blood boil. Every detail of the scam Marion pulled on her own father was crueler than the last. Her childlike voice trembled as she recounted how the daughter forged documents, convinced her ailing father to sign over the restaurant's sale, promising a partnership that never existed. The money from the sale disappeared along with her, leaving only debts and despair behind. "My grandfather tried to help Mr. Thorne," Opal whispered, tears streaming down her bruised face. "But he was so sick, so abandoned." The private investigator entered the office with more documents, confirming every word from the girl. Old photographs showed the small restaurant, Mr. Thorne working in the kitchen, Marion serving tables with a barely concealed look of disgust. Sterling held each piece of evidence like burning embers, his anger growing as he saw the dates of the forged documents, coinciding with the time when her father was most debilitated by illness. "She planned it all," he muttered bitterly, waited for him to get too weak to resist. Mr. Thorne's lonely departure from this life was the most painful part of the account. Opal told how her grandfather found the man in a miserable public hospital room, days before he passed away. With no money for proper treatment, no news from his daughter, he died believing he had failed as a father. "He called for her until the end," Opal sobbed, her tiny hands clutching her dress tightly. Asked why his princess wouldn't come see him. Opal's grandfather, before his own illness confined him to bed, had tried to report the scam. As a close friend of Mr. Thorne, he knew all the details of the crime. But Marion had disappeared completely, resurfacing months later as a rich, sophisticated young woman, ready to conquer Sterling. "That's when she first saw me at the hospital," Opal explained. "She recognized that I was the friend's granddaughter of her father. That's why she hates me so much. I'm afraid of what she might do to my grandfather now." The accountant returned with more proof of the current embezzlement from the companies. The pattern was identical to the scam at the restaurant: forged documents, ghost accounts, money diverted to tax havens. Sterling watched the numbers with a gaze that grew harder with each discovery. The kind, trusting man was disappearing, giving way to someone colder, more dangerous. "She hasn't changed a thing," he said in a cutting voice. "She's just found a bigger prey." The transformation in Sterling was visible. His eyes, once gentle, now shone with calculated fury. The evidence piled up on his desk like a mountain of betrayals: the scam at the restaurant, the father's death, the millions embezzled, the abuse against Opal. Each revelation hardened his heart further, turning love into hate, trust into vengeance. "It was all a lie," he muttered to himself. Every smile, every kiss, every moment. More documents were arriving every minute: bank statements, fraudulent contracts, evidence of tax evasion. The fortune embezzled by Marion was larger than Sterling had imagined, enough to explain why his companies were on the brink of bankruptcy. Each new paper was another drop of poison in his heart. How could her father have trusted her until the end? He asked rhetorically. How could I have been so blind? Opal observed the transformation of her protector with a mixture of fear and hope. The kind Sterling who had saved her was giving way to someone capable of facing Marion at her own level of cruelty. The girl knew that the confrontation would be inevitable and devastating. "Are you going to send her to jail, sir?" she asked in a low voice, trembling at the mere thought of the possibility of the woman's revenge. Sterling's answer was a cold smile that Opal had never seen on his face before. He rose slowly, gathering all the documents with precise and controlled movements. The storm outside had passed, but a much worse one was forming inside the mansion. "No, little one," he finally replied, his voice unrecognizable from being so icy. "First, I'm going to destroy every inch of her luxurious life, exactly as she did with her father. Or I'll make sure she rots in the worst prison in Mexico, where she'll clean filthy bathrooms and serve violent inmates for the rest of her miserable life. I want her to feel in her flesh every humiliation she made others endure, until she begs for the death she denied her own father." Marion was in her luxurious walk-in closet, admiring the expensive jewels her scam had provided, when she heard Sterling's heavy footsteps coming up the stairs. There was something different about the rhythm of those steps, something that made her blood run cold. Through the mirror of her vanity, she saw her husband enter the room, carrying a thick folder of documents. His usually gentle face was transformed into a mask of controlled fury. "We need to talk," he said, his voice colder than ice. "Now." Following Sterling to the office, Marion felt the first real shiver of fear since she had started her scams. The way he walked, the way his shoulders were tense, the way his hands gripped the documents, everything indicated that her charade had come to an end. As they entered the room, she saw the desk covered in papers, bank statements, contracts, old photos. Her heart stopped for a second as she recognized a photograph of her father's restaurant. "Sterling, darling," she tried to smile, but her voice trembled. "What is all this?" With a brisk motion, Sterling spread the documents across the table, revealing every fraud, every embezzlement, every lie. The bank transfers, the forged contracts, the evidence of the scam at the restaurant, it was all there, exposed like open wounds. Marion felt her legs weaken when she saw the photo of her sick father, taken days before his lonely death. "So," Sterling began, his voice as sharp as a razor, "do you want to explain to me why my companies are failing while you have million-dollar accounts in tax havens?" The seconds dragged on like hours as Marion tried to formulate an explanation. Her calculating brain worked frenetically, searching for a way out, a convincing lie, anything that could save her. "Sterling, you're getting everything wrong," she tried to argue, her usually honeyed voice now sounding false even to her own ears. "I can explain every document, every transfer." But Sterling was no longer willing to listen to lies. He slammed his fist on the table, making the picture frames tremble. He picked up the photo of Marion's father and placed it directly in front of her. "Explain this," he demanded in a thunderous voice. "Explain how you could abandon your own father, to waste away alone until his last days, and then steal everything from him. Explain how you're doing the exact same thing to me." Marion's face lost all color as she realized there was no more escape. Her mask of sophistication began to crack, revealing the true person behind the facade. "You don't understand." Her voice rose an octave, bordering on desperation. "I deserved more. I deserved to get out of that miserable life. My father was weak. You're weak. All of you are too weak to do what needs to be done." The transformation on Sterling's face was terrifying. The last vestige of kindness disappeared from his eyes, replaced by a cold, calculating hatred that rivaled Marion's own cruelty. He approached her slowly, like a predator cornering its prey. "And Opal?" he asked in a dangerously low voice. "Did she also deserve all the torture you inflicted on her?" That was the final straw. Marion saw her life of luxury crumbling before her eyes. She tried to approach Sterling, to touch his face as she always did when she wanted to manipulate him, but he recoiled in disgust. "Don't you dare touch me," he hissed through clenched teeth, "ever again. Now, you have exactly one choice to make." The ultimatum came like a death sentence to all of Marion's ambitions. Sterling placed 2 documents in front of her, a divorce agreement renouncing any claim to his assets, and a folder with all the evidence of her crimes. "Either you sign your renunciation of everything right now and disappear forever." Sterling's voice came out like pure ice, his eyes burning with deadly hatred. "Or I swear on everything sacred that I will use every penny of my fortune, every connection I have, to make sure you rot in the worst prison in Mexico. And when you're there begging for mercy as you clean toilets and serve violent inmates, I will personally make sure your hell gets worse, every single day. Just as your father died in poverty because of you, you will wish for death every day for the rest of your miserable life. The last rays of the setting sun streamed through the office windows, casting dramatic shadows over the scene. Marion alternated between looking at the documents and Sterling's relentless face, realizing she had completely underestimated the man she thought she could manipulate forever. "How long do I have to decide?" she asked with a trembling voice. Sterling's response was immediate and definitive. "Until I finish this sentence." The office of the Calloway mansion, once a symbol of power and luxury, now transformed into a prison for Marion. Sterling had strategically blocked the only exit, his imposing figure unrecognizable in the fury that consumed him. The documents scattered across the table told the story of betrayal that would forever destroy the marriage she had fought so hard to achieve. For the first time in her life of manipulations, Marion tasted the bitter flavor of true fear. There is no way out this time, she thought, her eyes frantically scanning the room for escape. Outside the office, Darius stood guard silently. Sterling had been clear in his instructions: no one in, no one out without his express permission. The driver, who hours earlier had planned to leave that house forever, now found himself participating in the final moments of that charade. He could hear Marion's nervous pacing on the other side of the door, like a caged animal. "She will finally pay for everything," he muttered to himself, thinking of Opal and his own threatened children. Sterling moved around the office with the lethal calm of a predator, each step calculated to increase the psychological terror of his prey. His transformation was frightening. The kind man had given way to someone capable of rivaling Marion's cruelty. He picked up a photo of her father, purposefully placing it in front of his wife's eyes. "Look closely," he ordered in a cutting voice. "Look at the man you left to die in misery. Soon you will know the same fate." Marion tried to use her old manipulation tactics, approaching Sterling with eyes full of false tears. Her hands trembled as she tried to touch her husband's face, her honeyed voice rehearsing explanations. "Sterling, my love, you don't understand. I did all this for us. That restaurant was a dead weight. My father never knew how to manage anything." The slap on the table she received in response made her recoil in fear, realizing her tricks would no longer work. Upstairs, Opal was safe in her room, protected by Iris, the housekeeper. The girl could hear the echoes of the argument downstairs, each word laden with a tension that made her heart clench. Her small hands clutched the rosary she had found among her few belongings, praying not for revenge but for justice. "May God protect Mr. Sterling," she whispered, remembering the kind man who had saved her. The afternoon wore on as Sterling methodically presented his evidence. Each document was a new condemnation, each photo irrefutable proof of Marion's crimes. The man she thought she had completely dominated now cornered her with the same coldness she had always used against others. "You have exactly two options," he declared, his voice colder than winter, "and neither of them includes keeping a penny of what you stole." Marion began to feel the desperation grow in her chest as she realized all the exits were blocked. She tried to change tactics, threatening to expose secrets about Sterling's business, but each threat was met with a cruel smile that made her freeze. "If you dare open your mouth about my business," Sterling hissed with murderous coldness, pointing his finger towards Marion's face like a ferocious animal, "I will use every penny of my fortune to ensure you rot in the worst prison in Mexico. And believe me, dear, I can make your life in prison so miserable that you will beg every day to die, exactly as your father begged for you until his last breath." The sun began to set, painting the office with orange shadows that gave an even more dramatic air to the scene. Sterling approached his wife with deliberately slow steps, savoring the fear he saw growing in her eyes. On the table between them, two documents awaited a decision: the total renunciation of any right to the Calloway fortune, or the formal denunciation of all her crimes. "Choose wisely," he warned, his voice carrying a somber promise of revenge, "because this is your last chance to walk out of here." The antique clock on the wall marked each second with a deafening ticking. Marion looked at the documents as if they were snakes ready to strike. Her hands, always so steady when signing fraudulent contracts, now trembled uncontrollably. "How long do I have to think?" she asked, her voice faltering for the first time. Sterling merely smiled, a smile that never reached his eyes. "The time it takes for this pen's ink to dry." Marian's hand trembled as she signed the total renunciation of her assets, her elegant calligraphy now transformed into nervous scribbles. Each signature was like a stab in her pride, each turned page another step in her downfall. Her perfectly manicured nails, which hours earlier had hurt Opal, now left marks of tension on the palm of her own hands. She looked at Sterling one last time, searching for any remnant of the man she had manipulated for so long, but found only an icy stare that made her shudder. "You have 15 minutes to pack a bag and disappear." The luxurious closet, once her particular kingdom, now felt suffocating as Marian threw some clothes into an expensive suitcase. Her fingers ran over the imported dresses, the valuable jewelry, everything she would have to abandon. Each item left behind was a bitter reminder of her failed plan. Her hands stopped on a particularly valuable necklace, but Sterling's cutting voice stopped her. "Only the basics. Any attempt to take anything of value will be considered theft, and you know what happens next." Her descent down the main staircase was her last humiliation in that house. The employees who had once trembled at her presence now watched her with a mixture of thinly veiled satisfaction and contempt. Darius remained at his post, his hard eyes following every move of the woman who had threatened his family. On the last step, Marian still tried to maintain the haughty pose that characterized her, but the weight of defeat curved her shoulders. "You'll bitterly regret this." As Marian was escorted to the gate, Sterling ordered Opal to be summoned. The girl descended the stairs timidly, still fearful despite Iris assuring her that everything was all right now. Her little feet, once forced into heavy labor, now touched the marble floor with caution. Sterling awaited her in the same office where moments before he had destroyed Marian's empire of lies, but his face had softened completely at the sight of the child. "Come here, little one. It's over." The sound of the gate closing marked the exact moment when Marian left the Calloway mansion forever. Sterling, now alone with Opal in the office, felt all his previous fury transform into paternal tenderness. He observed the girl, still hurt from the tortures she had endured, but with a new glimmer of hope in her eyes. "Now," he began softly, "I want to reward you for everything you've been through. What do you want? This mansion can be your home forever. I can ensure the best education, give you all the money you need." Sterling's words were interrupted by a stifled sob from Opal. The girl, who had endured so many cruelties with surprising strength, now let the tears flow freely down her face. Her little hands nervously clutched the hem of her dress as she gathered the courage to speak. "Mr. Sterling," her voice came trembling with emotion, "I don't need any of that." Sterling knelt down to be at the girl's level, his heart softening even more at the sight of the purity of that soul who had suffered so much. He took her small bruised hands in his, feeling them tremble slightly. "There must be something you want, anything, just ask," he gently insisted. "Nothing is too much after everything you've been through." Opal raised her eyes, finally finding the courage to make her request. There was no greed in her gaze, only love and concern. "I just want medicine for my grandfather, sir. And maybe a bag of fruit. He loves fresh fruit so much, but it's been so long since he could eat." Her voice failed, choked by the simplicity of her own request. Sterling felt his legs weaken before the simplicity of the request. After everything she had endured, after all the cruelty she had suffered, Opal only thought of her grandfather's well-being. Tears began to stream down his face before he could contain them, as he observed the small figure before him, so hurt and yet so pure. In his chest, the heart that hours before had been consumed by fury now overflowed with emotion. "Just that?" he managed to murmur, his voice choked. "After everything, you just want medicine and fruit?" Outside the mansion, Marian walked alone on the sidewalk, her expensive suitcase dragging on the asphalt like a symbol of her downfall. The last rays of the setting sun cast long shadows that seemed to point accusingly in her direction. Her high heels, once a symbol of power, now echoed a melancholic rhythm of defeat. She stopped for a moment, taking one last look at the mansion that had almost been hers, and saw through the office window the scene that would be her final torment. Sterling embracing Opal paternally, both crying in a moment of pure emotion. In the office, Sterling was already on the phone, giving rapid orders that went far beyond Opal's simple request. It wouldn't just be medicine, it would be the best private treatment money could buy. It wouldn't just be a bag of fruit, it would be a lifetime of comfort and dignity. As he spoke, he watched the girl who now smiled shyly, her eyes shining with grateful tears. "I want the best hospital room prepared immediately," he ordered, "and a full team of specialists." Opal could hardly believe what she was hearing. Her small request had turned into an avalanche of kindness that left her speechless. Sterling continued making calls, arranging not only medical treatment, but also the transfer of her grandfather to a private hospital, the renovation of their humble home, enrollment in a prestigious school. With each new provision, the girl felt her heart tighten with emotion. "But Mr. Sterling," she tried to gently protest, "it's too much. We don't need so much." Night had fallen completely over California when Darius entered the office, announcing that Marion had definitively left. Sterling nodded gravely, a final shadow of his previous fury crossing his face, before dissipating completely as he looked at Opal. The driver, who had decided to stay after the day's events, smiled discreetly at the scene of affection between the two. "The documents have been filed, sir," he informed. "She can no longer return." The moment was interrupted by a call from the hospital. Opal's grandfather was being prepared for transfer. The girl clutched her hands nervously at the news, torn between the joy of knowing her grandfather would be well cared for and the natural fear of change. Sterling noticed her apprehension and knelt down beside her again, gently drying her tears with a handkerchief. "Little one," he said softly, "your life of suffering is over. Now you will know what it is to be truly loved and protected." On the other side of the city, Marion entered an ordinary taxi, her expensive suitcase now covered in street dust. As the vehicle drove away from the life of luxury she had built on lies, her eyes burned with tears of hatred and humiliation. In her mind, plans for revenge were already forming, but something inside her knew her defeat was final. "Where to, ma'am?" asked the driver. She hesitated, realizing that for the first time in a long while, she had nowhere to go. At the mansion, preparations for a new life were taking shape. Iris was organizing a special room for Opal, this time not as a prisoner, but as the Princess Sterling had decided she would be. The little girl watched everything with marveled eyes, still not believing the radical change in her luck. "Tomorrow," Sterling promised, tenderly kissing her forehead, "we begin a new life, and this time it will be done the right way." The small house in the California suburbs was completely transformed under Sterling's personal supervision. The once peeled walls now displayed cheerful colors, and each room received carefully chosen new furniture. Opal's room became a magical space in shades of pink and purple, with a princess bed and a desk for studying. Her hands, once hurt from forced labor, now marveled as they slid over the wallpaper with tiny golden butterflies. At the private hospital, Opal's grandfather surprised the doctors with his extraordinary recovery. The specialists attributed the progress not only to the latest generation of medications, but mainly to the love and dedication of his granddaughter, who spent every afternoon by his side, reading stories and sharing the news of her new life. The generous pension guaranteed by Sterling allowed them to focus solely on recovery and studies, without financial worries. Enrollment in the city's most prestigious school opened a new world for Opal. Her teachers were impressed by her intelligence and thirst for knowledge. At school meetings, Sterling attended with paternal pride etched on his face. The first real smiles began to appear gradually, like flowers blooming after a long winter. Each small achievement brought more light to her eyes, once so marked by fear. The friendship between Sterling and Opal blossomed naturally. He discovered in her a companion for park strolls and long conversations about books and dreams. She found in him not only a protector, but a true father at heart. Darius, who remained as the driver, saw his own daughters playing with Opal in the mansion's garden, a sign that the times of fear had truly ended. 6 months after the events that changed their lives, Sterling organized a surprise party for Opal's birthday. The mansion was transformed into a fairy tale, with thousands of lights in the garden and a candy table that seemed straight out of a dream. Among the special gifts, a gold chain with a butterfly pendant symbolized her transformation. But what made Opal cry with emotion was a photo album documenting her journey of recovery alongside her grandfather. At the Callaway mansion, memories of the nebulous period caused by Marion in everyone's life no longer held any power. The future was as bright as Opal's smile, as promising as her dreams of becoming a doctor to help other children, and as secure as the love of her new family. The night ended with a scene that perfectly summed up the transformation. Opal asleep in Sterling's lap as he told one more story, her grandfather smiling in the armchair beside them, and a deep peace hovering over them all. Months passed, and in a completely different reality, the small bar on the outskirts of California was a world entirely removed from the lavish parties Marion used to attend. Her hands, once perfectly manicured, were now rough and stained with cleaning products. A simple, worn dress replaced designer clothing, and her high heels had given way to worn sneakers more suitable for long hours on her feet. Ironically, the rundown establishment resembled her father's restaurant. The same simplicity she had so despised, now her reality. "How life turns," she muttered to herself as she scrubbed a particularly stubborn stain on the counter. The customers were especially cruel in their rudeness, as if they could sense she didn't belong in that environment. Ill-mannered drunks would whistle at her, spill drinks on purpose, make jokes about her increasingly unkempt appearance. Each humiliation was a distorted mirror of how she used to treat people when she was on top. "Hey, you failed rat," a drunken customer yelled, purposefully spilling his bottle on the floor. "Go back to your place of origin cleaning up other people's mess. And do a good job, I want to see you on your knees scrubbing, just like the loser you've always been underneath that Madame disguise." The establishment's bathroom was her particular torment. As she scrubbed the filthy floor on her knees, memories of her Italian marble bathrooms invaded her mind. The expensive jewelry, party dresses, sophisticated dinners, it had all turned into a bitter memory that only increased the weight of her current condition. The strong smell of cheap disinfectant made her eyes burn, or maybe it was tears of rage she refused to shed. At night, alone in her small rented room behind the bar, Marion counted the day's coins. Tips were scarce, barely covering her basic needs. Debts piled up, late rent, electricity bills with disconnection warnings. The small loan she had taken out to buy the bar consuming every penny she earned. There were no more unlimited credit cards, only endless worries about how she would survive the next day. In her deepest moments of solitude, memories of her father tormented her. She now perfectly understood the weariness in his eyes after long shifts at the restaurant, the worry over the bills, the effort to keep everything running. The image of him leaving this life alone in a public hospital visited her in increasingly frequent nightmares. "Forgive me, Father," she whispered into the darkness, but knew it was too late for regrets. The daily humiliations seemed endless. Customers would leave the bar without paying. Others would make a point of soiling everything moments after she cleaned it. The verbal harassment was constant. "How much for the waitress? She must be really cheap," was one of the favorite jokes of the more inconvenient regulars. Each cruel word was like a punishment for all the times she had humiliated others in her former life. On that particular night, the crowd was especially intense and the customers crueler than normal. A group of drunken men made a point of spilling beer on the freshly cleaned floor, laughing when she had to wipe it all up again. Another customer purposefully vomited outside the toilet bowl in the bathroom, making comments about giving work to the broke princess. Every minute seemed an eternity of humiliations. The last customer of the night was the most cruel. Before leaving, he turned to Marion with a wicked smile. "You know, you remind me of someone. Wasn't it you, that socialite who appeared in the society columns? How does it feel to lose everything, huh?" His words hit like precise stabs, knocking down the last defenses she maintained. Alone at last, Marion observed her reflection in the stained mirror of the bar. She barely recognized the woman staring back at her. Deep dark circles, unkempt hair, expression hardened by bitterness. The tears began to fall when she realized she had transformed into exactly what she most despised, someone common, struggling to survive. The outburst began slowly, like a rising wave of despair. First a glass accidentally broken, then another thrown on purpose. Soon plates and glasses were flying through the kitchen as she screamed all her frustration and regret. Each broken piece represented a fragment of her former life shattering, each shard a reflection of her own sins coming back to haunt her. Finally, exhausted and surrounded by the wreckage of her fury, Marion collapsed onto the filthy kitchen floor. Her tears now flowed freely, mingling with the grime of the floor she would have to clean again. "This is all I deserved," she sobbed to herself. Every humiliation, every moment of solitude. The sun was beginning to rise when she finally got up, her legs trembling from the effort. There was a long list of tasks waiting, cleaning up the destruction of the night before, preparing the bar for another day of torments, continuing her endless penance. As she swept up the shards of her former life, a bitter truth finally crystallized. This was her poetic justice, her punishment perfectly suited to her crimes. Somewhere in the city, she knew Opal was happy with Sterling, that her father rested in peace, that all her victims had moved on. Only she remained trapped in this purgatory of her own making, paying each sin with sweat and tears. The bar was her prison, her punishment, her final destiny, just like the restaurant she had stolen from her father. The wheel had turned full circle, and Marion finally understood the true price of her ambition. Her hands trembled as she prepared the bar for another day. The smell of alcohol and cigarette smoke ingrained in the walls seemed to suffocate her, bringing painful memories of her father's restaurant. Each table she wiped, each glass she organized, was a reminder of how he had worked tirelessly to give her a better life. Now she understood the value of every drop of sweat he had shed, every sleepless night worrying over the bills, every sacrifice he had made for her. A customer knocked on the door, a drunk who had forgotten something the night before. His look of disdain upon recognizing her was another stab to her already shattered pride. "How the mighty have fallen," he mocked, stumbling into the bar. Marion swallowed her tears, continuing her mechanical cleaning routine. This was how it was now, each humiliation a reminder of her own past cruelties. On the wall behind the counter, a cracked mirror reflected her fragmented image, a perfect portrait of her shattered soul. Her eyes, once bright with ambition, were now dull and empty. Her hands, which had once flaunted priceless rings, were now marked by calluses and burn scars from work. This was her now, broken and patched like the mirror confronting her, living the life she had so despised. "The house always collects its debts," her father used to say. And now she fully understood the meaning of those words. Every drop of suffering she had caused had come back multiplied. Every tear she had made others shed now streamed from her own eyes. Her particular hell was only just beginning, and unlike her victims who had found redemption, her punishment seemed to have no end in sight. It was her destiny now, to live eternally in the same nightmare she had created for others. If you enjoyed this story, we invite you to like this video and subscribe to our channel. Your support motivates us to keep bringing exciting stories almost every day. Don't miss the next surprising narrative that is about to appear on your screen. We are immensely grateful to have you here with us. Now you can click on the links appearing on the screen right now. We have a special selection just for you, filled with valuable stories and guaranteed entertainment. See you there.